Joe here. Today we're going to take a look at this game, Orange Swan. This is a two-player strategic World War II game about the war in the Pacific from 1941 to 1945. This is a game designed by Emanuele Santandrea, and he is also the game artist. And this game is going to be published by VentoNuovo Games through a Kickstarter campaign that starts on June 24. We'll be taking a look at the game's setup, sequence of play, and we will go through some of the examples of play that will appear in the game's rulebook. Before we begin with the game setup, let's take a look at the game pieces and the types of units represented in the game. Let's take a look at the different types of naval units in the game. Capital ships include CV and HS class naval units. At left, you see a Japanese CV class or aircraft carrier unit with information printed in blue. And at right, you see an American HS or heavy surface ship unit with its information printed in red. Capital ships can be identified by their angled ship silhouettes. This is a Japanese LS or light surface ship class unit, and it's denoted by its information printed in white. And the last type of naval unit is the subclass, like this Commonwealth submarine unit. This type of naval unit has its information printed in black. In this game, some of the units are elite units, and these are denoted by a darker background as the Japanese heavy surface unit that you see here at right. The smaller 5/8 of an inch wooden blocks represent ground and air units. Here we see a Japanese infantry unit with a maximum strength of 3. To its right, we see a Commonwealth air unit with a maximum strength of 4. Next is an American Marine division. Here we see a Japanese artillery unit, a Japanese tank unit, and there's two types of Chinese units in the game. Purple units are Chinese nationalist units, like the one shown here. And units in red represent Chinese communist units. Like in all block games, whenever a unit takes a hit, you rotate the unit 90 degrees to represent one less strength point. And if a unit with a strength of 1 receives 1 hit, it is eliminated. So in this game, the major nations are Japan, the United States, the Commonwealth, and China. Each major nation has its own set of units in specific color, force pool, economic, and strategic power. One thing that I like about this game is the way it neatly organizes information on the map. So you just glance at the map and you immediately know what's going on without having to lift pieces and look for information beneath them. And here we see the South China Sea zone. And this zone is not controlled by any of the sides because there's no control disk on the white circle. Inside the white circle, there's a list of ports that have an impact on this sea zone. And it starts with Hanoi. When we take a look at Hanoi, Hanoi's land area is occupied by Japanese ground forces, and that makes the port of Hanoi a garrison port. And only garrison ports produce opposition discs. Those are the round wooden discs that you see on the map. And opposition discs have an impact on naval movement and naval combat in the sea zone where they are located. And you also see here the Japanese garrison port of Taan, which also produces an opposition disc, and the garrison Japanese port of Canton, which produces the third Japanese opposition disc in the South China Sea zone. We also see that Hong Kong is garrisoned by a Commonwealth unit. Hong Kong is encased in a square, meaning it is a small land area, and its anchor symbol is in red, meaning that it is a bifrontal port. Hong Kong touches upon the South China Sea and also upon the Eastern China Sea, and therefore, if the port is garrisoned, it produces an opposition disc in each one of the sea zones that it touches upon. And finally, there's the port of Manilla. We see Manilla with yellow letters and a red border. That means that Manila is a capital, in this case, capital of the Philippines. There is a big yellow star, meaning that Manila is a strategic space, and strategic spaces are important in this game for victory conditions and production. Also, there is a small supply symbol, and that means that Manila is a supply source for the Allies. Manila, of course, is garrisoned, and garrisoned strategic ports produced 2 opposition discs. So the Allies in the South China Sea have 3 opposition discs, 2 for Manila and 1 for Hong Kong. And finally, we see the submarine symbol. And the submarine symbol means that the South China Sea zone is taken into consideration each turn when resolving strategic naval warfare. There are 11 strategic areas represented in the game, and these areas are critical for victory conditions and for production purposes. Let's take a look at them. Tokyo is the Japanese capital and also a supply source for all Japanese units. Delhi is the capital of India and a supply source for American and Commonwealth units. It is one of the 2 Commonwealth capitals in the game. Sydney in Australia is the 2nd Commonwealth capital, and it is also a supply source for American and Commonwealth units. The Japanese have a strategic area in mainland China in Nanking. Meanwhile, to the west is Chongqing, which acts as the Chinese capital in the game. Manila is the Philippine capital and also a supply source for American units. In Malaya is the port city of Singapore. Note the star-shaped symbol. That means that Singapore is also a fortress. It is a bifrontal port, and it provides 2 ops discs in the Gulf of Thailand as well as in the Java Sea. In the Caroline Islands is the strategic area of Truk, which starts in control of the Japanese. And notice that it is garrisoned. It produces 2 ops discs, and it has a diamond shape with pointed edges, meaning that it is a small, rough island. Here we see Hawaii, an American strategic area in the Hawaiian Islands. And we see that in that same sea zone, there is the island of Johnston. And notice that it has a diamond shape, but with round edges, meaning that it is a small, clear island. Rough islands like Truk provide a defensive bonus to its defenders. On the right-hand bottom corner of the map is the American strategic area of Samoa. And the last strategic area is actually composed of 4 areas which contain the Burma Road symbol. And these are Dhaka, Mandalay, and Rangoon in Burma, and Kunming in China. In this game, each turn is composed of an Axis turn followed by an Allied turn. And a player's turn is divided into the following 5 phases. First is the production phase, and the declaration of war step. In this game, all nations are at war at the start of the game except the Dutch East Indies, which begin the game neutral and cannot be attacked during the first Axis player turn. It joins the Allies during the first Allied turn. Next is Supply Check. Here, the phasing player checks his units to see if they can trace a line of communications to a supply source, and unsupplied units are marked with a white cube. Next is Collect Production Points. Here, the phasing player's nations collect production points based on their economic power, which is generated by the areas that the nations control, which are in supply. Next is Strategic Air Warfare, and this is performed against Japan during the Axis production phase by taking into consideration both sides' air units in the large umbrella area on the map. Strategic Air Warfare against China is resolved during the Allied production phase by taking into consideration both sides' air units within the small umbrella area printed on the map. And the Strategic Combat Results table is used and losses are applied. Next is Strategic Naval Warfare, and this is performed against Japan during the Axis production phase by taking into consideration all naval units that are in sea zones marked with a submarine or orange ship icon. And again, the Strategic Warfare Combat table is consulted and losses are applied. Next is to spend production points. Here, the active player spends production points to purchase and deploy new units, or to reinforce units that are already on the map, or to purchase Blitz discs, which will allow the nation to conduct a double move. And this phase ends by updating sea control. Here, the sea zones are checked to see if they are contested or controlled by the Axis or the Allied player. The next phase is the naval phase. Here, the active player conducts naval movement with his units. And then, naval engagement means that in sea zones, which have naval units of both sides, the phasing player rolls a die to search for enemy units and determine if a naval combat will take place there. Next is naval combat, and this is resolved in each Z zone in the order determined by the phasing player. And finally, we update sea control once again. The next phase is the land phase, and it starts with seaborne operations. And this step is only performed if the phasing player purchased the Oceanic Blitz disc. If so, the player conducts amphibious assaults and also any assault transports and any opposition fire against said assaults. The next step is the land movement step. Here, the phasing player may move his land units that did not perform seaborne operations. Next is strategic movement, where the phasing player spends strategic movement points to move a ground or air unit an unlimited number of areas or sea zones, according to the rules. Next is land combat. Here, the phasing player resolves combat in any land areas that contain units of both sides in the order determined by the phasing player. Retreat after combat. The losing side in any land combat must retreat any surviving units. And this phase ends again by updating sea control. The next phase is the Blitz phase, and this phase only occurs if a side purchased an Oceanic Blitz disc, a Continental Asia Blitz disc, or both. Otherwise, the phase is skipped. A double Blitz may occur if the player purchased both the Oceanic and Continental Asia Blitz discs. If the player purchased an Oceanic Blitz disc, the player activates all currently in supply friendly naval units and all ground and air units in ports, and may perform a second full naval phase followed by a limited second land phase. If the player purchased a Continental Asia Blitz disc, the player now activates those friendly air and ground units in Continental Asia, which can perform a second land phase. And the phase ends by updating sea control. Lastly is the final phase. We go to the nation's surrenders check. Here, the players check to see if conditions are such that the US, Japan, the Commonwealth, the Philippines, or the Dutch East Indies surrender. Next is units surrender check. Here, units with an out-of-supply white cube are checked, and if they're in supply, the white cube is removed. But if they're still out of supply, the unit is eliminated, and the exceptions are Japanese units, and there's a special code of Bushido rule, and units in fortresses, which are reduced by 1 step if they are found out of supply and are never eliminated for being out of supply. And Chinese units never surrender in this game. Then we update sea control once again, and finally we perform a victory check. We check for seasonal and, if applicable, year-end victory. In this supply example, the U.S. Light Surface Unit in the Solomon Sea is in supply. It can trace supply to the adjacent friendly controlled New Hebrides Sea Zone, and from there to San Diego. Note also that the larger blue disc indicates U.S. control of the sea zone. The U.S. Marine Unit in Guadalcanal, however, will be marked as out of supply, since the adjacent sea zone, the Solomon's Sea, is contested by 2 Japanese naval units. Let's take a look at a production example. Japan begins the game with 25 production points. That is 5 for Tokyo, 5 for Chakchung, 5 for Nanking, 5 for Saigon, and 5 for Truk. Japan has conquered Singapore, which adds 5 more, as well as Manila, and also Java and Sumatra. But Java and Sumatra are not able to trace a supply line to Tokyo, so their 10 production points are not counted. So Japan has a total of 45 production points, and the Allies are not in a position to reduce this total via strategic warfare. So Japan plans a major attack on China. So it purchases the Continental Asia Blitz disc, but declines to purchase the Oceanic Blitz. That leaves 25 production points to spend on units. Japan's strategic power is 5, 3 for the strategic areas it controls at the beginning of the game. That is Tokyo, Nanking, and Truk, plus 2 that have been conquered, that is Singapore and Manila. Because the Japanese have a strategic power of 5, they can purchase 5 new units, and they randomly draw 1 large naval unit and 4 small air/ground units. The drawn naval unit cannot be reinforced further in this turn because the deployment step counts against the 1 step per naval unit per turn reinforcement limit. The 4 drawn small blocks, however, can be reinforced in more than 1 step, and the Japanese spend 8 production points reinforcing one of the air units by 2 steps, each step costing 4 production points. The Japanese spend 4 production points to reinforce a 1-step carrier unit on the board. Now it has 2 steps. And with 3 production points left, the Japanese decide to reinforce the newly arriving infantry unit that has 1 step to 4 steps. In this game, before there is naval combat, there has to be a successful naval engagement. And the phasing player rolls a die and adds the total number of naval units plus ops discs in the C zone, and the sum has to be 11 or more for naval combat to occur. Here we see that naval combat will be automatic. There are 3 Japanese and 2 American units, that is 5, 2 Allied opposition discs, that is 7, and 3 Japanese opposition discs, which brings the total to 10. So any die roll from 1 to 6 will reach 11. So engagement here is automatic. Here we see the situation in the Gilbert Islands, where each side has 1 sub-unit. So even with a roll of 6, the maximum result that can be reached is 8. So there will be no engagement and therefore no battle in this sea zone. This is a combat example that is not found in the rule book, but I wanted to make one so that you can have an idea of how combat works. First, we have to check if there is engagement, and we'll say that it is the Japanese player's turn, and the Japanese have 4 ships, the Allies 3, that's 7, and there's 1 opposition discs, so that's 8, and we need an 11 after we roll 1d6. And the roll is a 4, so it is 12, so there will be a battle. Naval combat is fought at most in 5 subphases in order of unit class, and the first class that fires are opposition discs, and there is an Allied opposition disc. Ops discs hit on 5 or more unless it is the Japanese surprise turn, which in this example it is not. So we roll 1d6, and the roll is a 4, so the ops disc does not hit. Next class to fire is the CV class, and the Americans have 1. Capital ships like CVs and heavy ship units that are unopposed by the same Navy class at the instant of their roll earn a +1 hit bonus. So the carrier, because it has a strength of 2, will roll 2d6, and on 4 or more there will be hits. But the roll is a 2 and a 1. Both are misses. So now we move on to our next class in priority, which is the heavy ship class. And here we see that the Japanese have 1 unit with a strength of 3, and the Americans also have a heavy ship unit with a strength of 3. So now combat will be simultaneous, and each side rolls 3 dice and will score hits on 5 or more. The Japanese scored 1 hit and the Americans did not score a hit. So the targeted American ship absorbs the hit and has a strength of 2. And now we move on to the next category, the light ship class. The unopposed bonus only applies to capital ships, and light ships are not capital ships. So the Japanese have 2 units with a total strength of 7, so they roll 7 dice and they will hit on 5 or more. 4 hits, and the 4 hits are applied to the strongest unit on the opposite side. And there's a tie between the American carrier and the American heavy ship unit. 2 of the 4 hits sink the American heavy ship unit, and there's still 2 hits remaining, which is applied to the strongest unit, and that's the CV unit, which is now sunk. Now we move on to the last class, the submarine class. And they have a special rule. They always choose their target even if opposed by an enemy sub, and they distribute hits as desired after their roll, except that subs can't hit enemy subs under any circumstances. And to hit an enemy sub, a side must have either a CV, that's a carrier, or light ship units present. So we roll 2d6 for the Japanese and 1d6 for the Americans. The Japanese rolled a 6, and that sinks the American sub because the Japanese have light ship units, but not before the American sub rolls a 5 and can designate its target, and it designates the Japanese heavy ship unit, which now has a strength of 2. And after resolving this naval battle, we changed the control marker of the Nauru Sea Zone to a Japanese control marker. During the supply check of the Allied turn, the 2 U.S. naval units, the CV and LS in the Arafura Sea and the infantry unit on Ambon, are unable to trace supply to San Diego, which is off the screen to the right, as the Coral Sea, which is to the east, is a contested sea zone, and the Java Sea to the west, as well as the Celebes Sea to the north, are Axis controlled. The U.S. units, however, can trace supply through the adjacent port of Darwin, then overland to Sydney. Additionally, if Sydney fell, they could trace to the southwest starting in the Timor Sea and then through eastern and northern Indian Ocean, Ceylon, and the Gulf of Bengal, assuming they're all controlled by the Allies, and then into the port of Calcutta and overland to Delhi. Control of sea zones is critical in this game, and to determine control, each side adds the number of naval units and ops discs that it has on a particular zone. And a zone is controlled by a side if that side has at least double the number than the other side. Otherwise, the sea zone is contested. Here we see the Coral Sea. It is a contested sea zone. The Japanese have 2 naval units there plus 1 ops discs for the garrison at Jili Jili for a total of 3 versus 1 Commonwealth naval unit plus 3 Allied ops discs. That's 2 discs for Sydney and 1 for Port Moresby for a total value of 4. Note that Brisbane is vacant and therefore it does not contribute any ops discs. So the total in the Coral Sea is 3 for Japan and 4 for the Allies, and because neither side has double the total than the other, the sea zone is contested and neither side can trace supply through that sea zone. Now, supposing that the Allied player were to garrison Brisbane with the air unit that was at Darwin and move an additional naval unit into the Coral Sea, then assuming that all units survived any naval combat, the Allies would control the Coral Sea 6-3, and we would place the corresponding Allied control marker. In sea zones, the maximum stacking limit per side is 4 naval units. However, the Japanese have unlimited stacking and transport capacity in the inland sea. Similarly, the US and the Commonwealth have unlimited stacking and transport capacity in the Indian Ocean. And the US and the Commonwealth have unlimited stacking and transport capacity in the US coastal waters sea zone. In the opening turn of the 1941 campaign, Japan, which starts with an oceanic Blitz disc, attacks Manila in a seaborne operation with an elite 4-step air unit, a regular 4-step air unit, an elite infantry unit at 4 steps, and a regular infantry unit at 3 steps. Note that both infantry units have to be at full strength at the beginning of the operation, but here they each received fire from 3 Allied ops discs while crossing the South China Sea, and 1 of the op discs rolled a 6, obtaining a hit on the regular Japanese infantry unit, and that's why it is at 3 strength. And during the naval combat, 2 U.S. naval units that started the campaign in that sea zone were destroyed, and the sea zone became Japanese controlled. So Allied ops fire hit only on 6s rather than 5 or more. Before the landing, the adjacent full-strength Japanese heavy ship unit provides support fire. Note that the Japanese CV does not provide support fire because it is not at full strength. So the heavy ship unit will roll 1 die and it will hit on a 5 or more, but there is a +1 first turn surprise bonus for the Japanese in fall 1941. The roll is a 4 modified to a 5, and that is a hit. But because Manilla is a rough terrain space denoted by the green background color of the terrain, it absorbs 1 hit in each combat situation. Next is the air subphase, and Japan chooses its elite air unit to fire first, and the Allies must choose their only air unit for the first round. The Japanese air unit with its elite status and the surprise bonus will get a +2 to its die roll, and the American air unit has no such bonus. The Japanese roll a 6, a 5, and 2 2s modified to 7, 6, and 2 3s, inflicting 2 hits, while the US unit rolls a 5 and a 1, inflicting 1 hit. The US air unit is eliminated, absorbing both hits, and the Japanese choose to take the 1 hit on their elite air unit, although this is a tough choice since the regular air unit has yet to fire. Next, the regular Japanese air unit fires, but there is no unopposed bonus because there is rough terrain in the defending area. But there is the surprise bonus, so there will be a +1 added. So the roll is a 4, 3, a 2, and a 1 modified to a 5, 4, 3, and a 2 for 1 hit. And the US must take the hit with their strongest unit, which is the only unit they have, which is the artillery unit, which is now down to a strength of 1. The next class to fire is artillery. Only the US has an artillery unit, so it will roll 1 die, but it has an unopposed bonus because the rough terrain only negates the bonus for the attacker, not for the defender. So we roll 1d6, and the roll is a 6 modified to a 7, so the Japanese have to take the hit on their strongest unit. The Japanese have 2 4-strength units, their elite infantry unit and their regular air unit, so they have to choose which one will absorb the hit. The Japanese choose the 4-step elite infantry unit. The reason for choosing the elite infantry unit is because the air unit still costs more to replace. Now the infantry units fire. Only the Japanese have infantry, 1 elite and 1 regular infantry unit. The elite unit will roll 3 dice and will receive a +2 modifier, 1 for being elite and the other one for the special surprise Japanese fall 1941 bonus. The regular unit will roll 3 dice and will receive a +1 for surprise. So we roll first for the elite unit, and the roll is a 3, a 1, and a 1 modified to a 5, a 3, and a 3, and that is enough to eliminate the 1-step US artillery unit. Now let's suppose that by a miracle the Japanese failed to destroy the US artillery unit. They would have to retreat, because the retreat priorities, remember, call for the defender to elect to retreat first, and let's say the Americans don't want to retreat, and then the attackers may retreat if they want to, and the Japanese would say, well, we don't want to retreat. But option 3 is that if neither side chooses to voluntarily retreat, the attacker has to retreat if the area is rough terrain. And Manilla is rough terrain, so the Japanese would have to retreat. And this would be a retreat by sea. And this can only happen if there's any unused Japanese naval units remaining to carry the infantry back to a friendly controlled land area. The air units, they can fly home, but both the air and infantry would take an automatic hit. And it would be a hit for each sea zone that they enter, and the infantry in addition would suffer any enemy ops and naval fire in every sea zone that they enter. So as you can see, everything is on the line in these amphibious attacks. So we've reached the end of this video. We haven't covered everything that the game includes. However, supply is critical. Unsupplied land areas will not produce strategic nor production points. So players must be able not only to take these important islands and territories, but keep them in supply in order for players to build their armies and maintain them on the field and their navies at sea. So this is Orange Swan, a game designed by Emanuele Santandrea and to be published by VentoNuovo Games through a Kickstarter campaign that begins on June the 24th. This is Stuka Joe, signing off for now. Thanks for watching.